The stars looked the same as they always did through the viewport of the Earth defense ship Valiant. Captain Jake Morrison stood with his hands behind his back and watched the empty space beyond the invisible barrier. 300 years had passed since the Galactic Council placed humanity under quarantine. 300 years since humans were told they were too dangerous to walk among the civilized species of the galaxy. The barrier surrounded Earth and all its colonies like a cage made of energy and automated weapons. Any ship that tried to cross would be destroyed instantly without warning or mercy. Jake had been born into this imprisonment. His father served on border patrol and his grandfather before that. The Morrison family had spent generations watching a wall they could never cross. Sometimes Jake wondered what his ancestors did to deserve this fate. The history books said humanity was too violent and too unpredictable. They said humans started too many wars and solved too many problems with force. The council decided the galaxy would be safer if humanity stayed locked away in their own small corner of space. Lieutenant Amy Chen walked onto the bridge carrying a datapad. She had been reviewing the daily reports from Earth Central Command. Nothing ever changed in these reports. They documented the same routine activities day after day and year after year. Humanity had learned to make the most of their prison. They built cities on Mars that stretched across entire valleys. They established colonies under the ice of Europa, where millions of people lived and worked. The moons of Saturn held vast farming stations that fed the growing population. Humans had expanded as far as they could within their boundaries. Amy handed the datapad to Jake without saying anything. He glanced at it briefly, then set it aside. They both knew what it contained. Supply manifests and personnel transfers and maintenance schedules. The mundane details of a species that had nowhere to go but had refused to stop growing anyway. Commander Ryan Blake approached from the sensor station. His face showed concern, which was unusual for the normally calm officer. He carried his own datapad, and the screen showed readings that made no sense. Energy signatures appeared at the edge of their long-range sensors. Weapons fire in massive quantities, explosions that registered even at this extreme distance. Jake took the pad and studied the information carefully. Beyond the quarantine barrier and council space, something terrible was happening. The sensors showed battle formations and defensive positions collapsing. Ships were dying out there. Lots of ships. The council had maintained perfect peace for over 1,000 years. War was something they considered primitive and barbaric. Yet someone or something was attacking them with overwhelming force. The crew of the Valiant gathered around their stations and watched the data stream in with growing alarm. The battle was moving closer to human space. Whatever enemy the council faced was pushing through their defenses like they were made of paper. The energy signatures matched nothing in the human database. These were not council weapons or council ships. Something new had entered the galaxy and it was destroying everything in its path. Within 2 hours, the first distress call reached the Valiant. The automated council station nearest to the quarantine barrier sent out an emergency broadcast on all frequencies. The message repeated over and over in a dozen different languages. Unknown hostile forces had breached council space. Multiple fleets were falling back in retreat. Civilian populations were being evacuated, but there was nowhere safe to run. The enemy absorbed energy weapons and their shields adapted to every attack. Council forces were dying and they had no way to stop the advance. Jake stood at the center of his bridge and made a decision that felt both natural and momentous. He ordered his communications officer to respond to the distress call. The message went out on the same frequency the council used. It was brief and direct. Earth Defense had received the call for help. However, humanity remained bound by the quarantine that the council themselves had imposed. Human ships could not cross the barrier to provide assistance unless the council granted explicit permission. The response came back faster than Jake expected. A hologram appeared above the communications console showing a council overseer. The alien was a crystalline being whose species had been members of the council for thousands of years. Their features twisted in an expression that Jake recognized as fear. The overseer spoke quickly with their voice breaking. The quarantine was hereby temporarily lifted. Human vessels were authorized to cross the barrier and engage the enemy. The council was begging for help from the very species they had imprisoned. Jake felt something stir in his chest. It was not anger or resentment, though he had every right to both feelings. It was purpose. For 300 years, humanity had been forced to sit and watch while the galaxy continued without them. They had been called dangerous and violent and unfit for civilized space. Now that civilization was dying, and they had nowhere else to turn. They needed the dangerous humans after all. He opened a channel to Earth Central Command. The response came within minutes. Admiral Lisa Hayes appeared on screen from the command center deep beneath the surface of Earth. She was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had spent her entire career preparing for a war that everyone said would never come. Behind her, Jake could see the massive displays showing the entire human fleet. Admiral Hayes did not waste time with questions or debate. She gave orders that set 300 years of preparation into motion. The fleet would launch immediately. Every carrier and battleship and cruiser that humanity had built in secret would cross the barrier for the first time. Fighter squadrons would deploy. Marine units would prepare for boarding actions. Humanity was going to war, and they would show the galaxy exactly why the Council had been afraid. Jake closed the channel and turned to his crew. They looked back at him with expressions mixing excitement and nervousness. They had trained their entire lives for combat but never expected to actually see it. Now they would face an enemy that had defeated the most advanced civilization in the galaxy, an enemy that had made the Council desperate enough to free their prisoners. He gave the order and the Valiant moved forward. The barrier that had contained humanity for 3 centuries opened before them. Beyond lay Council space and the unknown enemy, and the chance to prove that dangerous did not mean evil. Sometimes dangerous was exactly what the situation required. Sometimes the violence that civilized species feared was the only thing that could save them from extinction. The human fleet began to cross the barrier ship by ship. Carriers emerged from their hidden construction yards. Battleships that had been disguised as mining vessels revealed their true nature. Humanity had spent 300 years preparing for this moment without knowing if it would ever come. Now it had arrived and they were ready. The galaxy was about to learn what humans could do when they stopped holding back. The Galactic Council had never seen human military tactics in action before. They were about to receive an education that would change everything they thought they knew about warfare. Admiral Lisa Hayes stood on the bridge of the flagship Liberty and watched her fleet move into position. The Liberty was enormous and heavily armed. For 50 years it had been officially listed as a colony transport vessel. That was a lie. It was a weapon of war built with every lesson humanity had learned from thousands of years of conflict on Earth. The enemy swarm appeared on the tactical displays like a dark cloud spreading across space. Thousands of organic ships moved together with frightening coordination. They had already destroyed 3 Council fleets and were moving toward the core worlds where trillions of civilians waited helplessly. The Council had sent their best commanders and their most advanced warships. None of it mattered. The enemy adapted to every weapon and tactic the Council used. Admiral Hayes gave her first order with calm confidence. All fighter wings were to launch immediately. The response was instant. From the Liberty and 12 other carriers, the fighters poured into space like angry insects defending their hive. These were not the sleek, elegant ships that the Council preferred. Human fighters were angular and ugly and covered with weapons. They had been designed for one purpose only, and that was killing. Commander Nick Palmer led the first squadron toward the enemy. His fighter was called the Reaper, and it carried kinetic weapons and missiles and railguns. The Council had dismissed these technologies as primitive decades ago. They preferred clean energy weapons that were efficient and elegant. But the enemy swarm had learned to adapt to energy weapons within minutes of first contact. They had never encountered bullets fired at incredible speeds. Nick opened fire at maximum range. His railgun sent metal slugs flying through space at a significant fraction of light speed. The rounds punched through 3 enemy ships before the swarm could react. The organic hulls split open and vented atmosphere and biological matter. More fighters joined the attack, and the space between the fleets filled with projectiles and explosions. The enemy tried to adapt their shields, but kinetic energy could not be absorbed or redirected. It simply smashed through whatever was in its way. Behind the fighter screen, the human battleships moved into formation. The Defiant and the Ranger were the largest warships humanity had ever built. Their main weapons were magnetic accelerators that used powerful electromagnets to launch projectiles. The rounds were made of depleted uranium and weighed as much as small cars. When they hit an enemy ship, the result was catastrophic. Armor crumpled and internal systems were crushed, and ships broke apart from the impact. The human cruisers added their firepower to the attack. They launched waves of missiles that used simple chemical explosives. The technology was ancient by galactic standards. The Council had stopped using chemical explosives thousands of years ago, but the enemy swarm had no defense against them. The missiles slammed into their hulls and detonated, and the shockwaves tore through organic tissue and vital systems. Admiral Hayes watched the battle unfold exactly as she had planned. The enemy was dangerous and numerous, but they had been designed to fight against energy weapons and shields. Humanity had brought guns and explosives and kinetic force. The swarm was dying faster than it could adapt. She opened a secure channel to her weapons officer. It was time to deploy the nuclear weapons. The Council observers monitoring the battle were horrified when they detected the nuclear signatures. Atomic weapons had been banned by galactic law for over 2,000 years. They were considered weapons of mass destruction too terrible to ever use again. Every civilized species had signed treaties promising to never build or deploy nuclear devices. But humanity had never signed those treaties because humanity had never been allowed to join the Council. Dozens of nuclear missiles streaked into the heart of the enemy formation. They detonated in brilliant flashes that lit up the darkness of space. The electromagnetic pulses disrupted the swarm's coordination systems. Ships collided with each other in confusion. The radiation burned through their organic hulls in ways that energy weapons never could. The swarm's formation broke apart as panic spread through their ranks. Lieutenant Greg Foster coordinated the Marine assault from his station on the Liberty. While the fleet engaged the swarm in space, the ground troops prepared for boarding actions. They wore powered armor that increased their strength and protected them from the vacuum. They carried automatic weapons that fired explosive rounds. Every Marine had trained for zero-gravity combat since they were teenagers. War might be considered obsolete in Council space, but humanity had never stopped preparing for it. The first boarding action began when the battleship Defiant forced a breach in an enemy vessel. Assault shuttles raced through the opening and clamped onto the interior hull. Sergeant Kelly Brooks led her squad through the airlock with weapons ready. The inside of the enemy ship was like nothing in the training simulations. The walls were alive and pulsing. The air was thick with spores. Strange biological growths covered every surface. The enemy creatures inside were massive and insectoid. They had natural armor plates and claws that could tear through steel. Against the Council species, these creatures would have been unstoppable. But the Marines wore armor that could withstand their attacks. Their weapons fired rounds that exploded on impact. The first wave of creatures charged at the Marines and died within seconds. Kelly and her squad pushed deeper into the ship, firing methodically and moving with practiced precision. The Marines fought their way to the navigation systems and downloaded everything they could find. The data showed coordinates for the enemy's origin point. They came from outside the galaxy, from dark space where nothing was supposed to exist. They had been traveling for decades, searching for biological matter to consume. The Council worlds were perfect targets because they were rich with life and had no real defenses. Back in space, the battle was turning into a massacre. The human fleet systematically destroyed every enemy ship they could target. The swarm tried to retreat, but the fighters pursued them relentlessly. Commander Palmer and his squadron hunted down the stragglers and left nothing alive. The space around the battlefield was filled with debris and frozen biological matter, and the remains of ships that had thought they were invincible. Admiral Hayes opened a channel to the Council command. Her message was brief and professional. The enemy swarm had been neutralized in this sector. Human forces were tracking the retreat vector and preparing to pursue. She recommended immediate evacuation of civilian populations along the projected path. This battle was over, but the war had just begun. A Council overseer appeared on the communication screen. It was the same crystalline being who had begged for help hours earlier. They looked stunned and grateful and frightened all at once. The Council wanted to discuss terms for continued cooperation. They wanted to thank humanity for saving countless lives. They wanted to understand how humans had defeated an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. Admiral Hayes allowed herself a small smile. The Council could wait for their explanations and their thanks. Right now there was work to do. The enemy was wounded but not destroyed. They would regroup and attack again. Humanity needed to find their base and eliminate the threat completely. She closed the channel and turned back to her fleet. For the first time in 300 years, human warships were operating in Council space. The galaxy was about to learn that the dangerous species they had locked away was exactly what they needed to survive. The human fleet pushed deeper into Council territory, hunting for the remaining enemy forces. What they discovered made even the most experienced veterans feel sick to their stomachs. Captain Jake Morrison and the crew of the Valiant found the first dead world 3 days after the initial battle. The planet had once been home to 15 billion people. Now it was nothing but bare rock and dust. Every living thing had been stripped away and consumed. The cities were gone. The oceans were gone. Even the atmosphere had been partially harvested. The enemy swarm had eaten an entire world. Lieutenant Amy Chen stood beside Jake on the bridge and stared at the readings in silence. She had never seen anything like this before. No one in human history had witnessed destruction on such a scale. The Council databases showed that this planet had been a center of art and culture. Millions of years of history had existed here. Now there was nothing left but emptiness and death. The fleet discovered more dead worlds as they advanced. Dozens of colonies had been completely consumed. The enemy moved from system to system like locusts, devouring everything in their path. The total death count was beyond calculation. Trillions of sentient beings had died screaming as the swarm tore apart their worlds. The Council had been powerless to stop it. Jake finally understood why the Council had been so desperate for help. They had built their entire civilization on the idea of universal peace. For thousands of years they had lived without war or violence. They had eliminated poverty and disease through cooperation and technology. But in creating this perfect peaceful society, they had forgotten how to defend themselves. When a true threat appeared, they had no warriors and no weapons and no understanding of how to fight back. Humanity had never forgotten those lessons. Even locked away behind the quarantine barrier, humans had continued to study warfare and tactics and strategy. They built weapons and trained soldiers and prepared for conflicts that might never come. The Council had called them dangerous for doing this. Now that danger was the only thing keeping the galaxy from total extinction. Admiral Hayes Zhao called a meeting of her senior officers aboard the Liberty. Commander Ryan Blake and Colonel Kevin Sanders and Lieutenant Sophie Wright gathered in the war room. The holographic display showed the Omega Nebula, where intelligence reports indicated the enemy was building a massive base. Sophie had been analyzing the data, and her findings were disturbing. The swarm was constructing something enormous in the heart of the nebula, some kind of hive structure that would serve as a launching point for attacks across the entire spiral arm. Colonel Sanders studied the tactical projections with a grim expression. The nebula was deep in unexplored space, far from any Council support. If the human fleet went in there, they would be completely alone. No reinforcements could reach them in time if things went wrong. They would either succeed or die trying. There would be no middle ground and no retreat. Lieutenant Wright pointed out another problem. The Council still had not officially lifted the quarantine. The temporary authorization only covered emergency defensive actions. Technically, the human fleet was operating outside their legal authority. They were useful tools for the Council to use, but nothing more. Once the crisis was over, humanity might find themselves locked away again with no gratitude and no recognition. Commander Blake leaned forward and spoke quietly. He understood the political situation, but he also understood something more important. They could not leave innocent civilians to die just because the Council had treated humans badly. There were trillions of people in Council space who had never voted for the quarantine. Children and families who just wanted to live in peace. Humanity had to help them, because it was the right thing to do. Jake Morrison joined the meeting through a holographic connection from the Valiant. He agreed with Blake completely. The mission had to be finished regardless of politics or recognition. But he also believed that humanity needed to make their position clear. No more quarantine. No more being treated as dangerous criminals. When this war was over, things would change, or humanity would walk away and let the Council face the next threat alone. Admiral Hayes made her decision. She would send terms to the Council immediately. Full membership with unrestricted access to galactic space, reparations for 300 years of forced isolation, a permanent seat on the Council's military command structure. These were non-negotiable demands. The Council could accept them, or humanity would complete this mission and then return to their own space, forever. The message was transmitted to the Council's central chamber, where representatives from 100 different species debated in emergency session. Some of the Council members were outraged by the human demands. They considered it blackmail and extortion. Others argued that humanity had earned the right to join the galactic community. They had saved billions of lives and were preparing to risk everything to eliminate the threat permanently. The debate continued for hours while the human fleet prepared for the final assault. Engineers worked around the clock, modifying weapons and reinforcing shields. Marines ran combat drills in the training bays. Fighter pilots flew endless simulations preparing for the battle that would determine the fate of the galaxy. Everyone knew this mission would be the most dangerous thing humanity had ever attempted. Sergeant Kelly Brooks gathered her squad in the Liberty's hangar bay. She looked at each of her Marines carefully. These were good soldiers who had trained their entire lives for combat. But training was not the same as real warfare. They were about to assault an enemy stronghold that would be defended by thousands of hostile creatures. The odds of survival were not good. Kelly needed them to understand what they were facing and why it mattered. She told them the truth without sugarcoating anything. They were going into the worst fight any human had ever seen. The enemy would outnumber them by huge margins. The council thought they were crazy for even attempting this assault. They were probably right about that. But humanity had been fighting against impossible odds since the beginning. They had survived ice ages and plagues and world wars. They had endured 300 years in a cage and come out stronger. This was what humans did. This was who they were. The squad responded with a unified shout of understanding. They were ready to fight and ready to die if necessary. They trusted their training and their equipment and each other. Whatever waited for them in the Omega Nebula, they would face it together. Captain Morrison stood alone in the Valiant's observation deck, looking out at the stars. He thought about his great-great-grandfather who had been alive when the quarantine was first imposed. That man had watched the barrier go up and had died knowing that humanity would never walk free among the stars again. What would he think of this moment? What would he say if he knew that the species who imprisoned them had come begging for help? Jake smiled despite the grim situation. His ancestor would probably say the same thing every other human was thinking. It was about time the galaxy realized they needed humanity after all. Being dangerous was not the same as being evil. Sometimes dangerous was exactly what the universe required to survive. The Omega Nebula burned with strange unnatural colors as the human fleet emerged from hyperspace. Before them, floating in clouds of ionized gas, was the hive. It was massive beyond anything they had imagined. The structure was the size of a small moon built from organic and metallic materials fused together in impossible ways. The surface crawled with movement as thousands of enemy ships swarmed around it like insects protecting their nest. Admiral Lisa Hayes studied the tactical displays with focused intensity. Every instinct told her this was going to be the hardest battle humanity had ever fought. The hive bristled with weapons and the enemy had pulled back all their remaining forces to defend it. But there was no choice. If the hive was allowed to survive, it would produce endless waves of ships that would eventually consume the entire galaxy. This ended here today, or it did not end at all. She gave the order and the fleet moved into attack formation. Human fighters swept ahead of the capital ships, engaging the defensive swarms. Commander Nick Palmer pushed his Reaper through a storm of enemy fire. His weapons blazed continuously as he targeted the hive's external weapon ports. Explosions blossomed across the organic surface, but new weapons grew to replace the destroyed ones within minutes. The hive was regenerating faster than they could damage it. Nick reported the problem back to the fleet. They needed to get inside the structure and attack it from within. Admiral Hayes had anticipated this. The battleship Defiant moved forward with its armor absorbing incredible punishment. Energy beams and projectiles hammered against its shields. Entire sections of hull plating burned away under the assault. But the Defiant kept advancing until it was almost touching the hive's surface. At point-blank range, the Defiant fired every weapon it had directly into the organic wall. The combined firepower tore open a massive breach that went deep into the hive's interior. Atmosphere and biological fluids vented into space. The opening was large enough for assault ships to enter. Colonel Sanders gave the order, and the Marine dropships launched from there, carriers racing toward the breach under heavy fire. Sergeant Kelly Brooks gripped her rifle tightly as her dropship shook from near misses. Around her, the rest of her squad checked their weapons one final time. They had trained for boarding actions, but nothing could really prepare them for what waited inside that alien structure. The ship crashed through the breach and into the hive's interior. The Marines poured out into a nightmare. The walls were alive and pulsing with bioluminescent fluids. The air was thick with spores that their suit filters struggled to process. Strange growths covered every surface, dripping with unknown substances. And the enemy was everywhere. Creatures emerged from the walls and ceiling, attacking with claws and mandibles. Kelly opened fire immediately. Her explosive rounds tore through the insectoid bodies as they swarmed forward. The Marines fought their way deeper into the hive. Every corridor was a battle. Every chamber held more enemies. The structure itself seemed to fight against them. Walls would suddenly sprout razor-sharp appendages. Floors opened into pits filled with digestive acids. The hive was designed to consume and destroy anything that entered it. But the Marines adapted to the hostile environment. They used plasma torches to seal passages behind them, preventing enemies from attacking their rear. They deployed small drones to scout ahead and identify threats. They moved as units supporting each other and covering every angle. Their training and technology gave them the edge they needed to survive. Lieutenant Greg Foster led a specialized team toward the hive's core. The intelligence they had gathered from captured swarm ships indicated that destroying the central nexus would cause the entire structure to fail. They fought through waves of defenders that grew more desperate as they approached their target. The enemy knew what the humans were trying to do and threw everything at them to stop it. They breached into a massive chamber that stretched hundreds of meters in every direction. At the center was a creature that defied description. It was enormous and partly organic and partly mechanical. Thousands of cables connected it to the hive, spreading throughout the structure like a nervous system. This was the Queen or Central Intelligence or whatever controlled the entire swarm. Greg ordered his team to arm the antimatter charges. These were the most powerful weapons humanity had ever created. Small devices that would release enough energy to tear apart a small planet. They placed the charges around the chamber while fighting off waves of defenders that seemed endless. The Queen creature made horrible sounds that resonated through their bones and armor. Outside the hive, the fleet battle had reached a critical point. The swarm was throwing everything at the human ships, trying to prevent them from supporting the Marines inside. The Liberty took a direct hit that knocked out half its power systems. Fires broke out on multiple decks. Casualty reports flooded into the bridge. Admiral Hayes refused to order a retreat. She redirected all remaining power to the weapons systems. They needed to keep the enemy occupied while the Marines completed their mission. The Liberty fired continuously even as more hits damaged the ship. Around them, other vessels were taking heavy damage. The cruiser Ranger lost its main engines and drifted out of formation. The destroyer Falcon exploded when its reactor was hit. Captain Jake Morrison and the Valiant swept in to protect the larger ships. They used their smaller size and speed to intercept enemy vessels targeting the carriers. Jake pushed his ship to the limits. Alarms blared as systems overheated and hull breaches multiplied, but they kept fighting because there was no other choice. Inside the hive, Greg's team finished placing the charges. They armed the timers and began their retreat back to the extraction point. The hive seemed to realize what was about to happen. The walls themselves tried to stop them. Passages sealed shut. New enemies spawned from organic pods. The Marines had to blast their way through with explosives and determination. Kelly's squad fought a running battle back to the breach. She carried a wounded Marine over her shoulders while firing one-handed. Her armor was scorched and cracked. Blood ran down her face from a cut above her eye. But she kept moving because that was what Marines did. They never left anyone behind. The dropships swooped in to extract the Marines as they reached the breach. Kelly was the last one to board. She jumped from the hive's surface as the ship pulled away. The pilot accelerated hard, putting distance between them and the doomed structure. All Marine units reported clear. Colonel Sanders gave the confirmation to Admiral Hayes. The antimatter charges detonated deep inside the hive's core. The explosion was beyond anything natural. Space itself seemed to tear apart at the detonation point. The entire structure began to break apart. Massive sections separated and drifted away. The Queen's death scream echoed across every communication frequency. It was a sound of rage and pain and the end of everything. The swarm ships in space suddenly lost coordination. They crashed into each other or spun out of control or simply stopped moving. The human fleet methodically destroyed them one by one until the nebula was silent. The battle was over and humanity had won. 6 months had passed since the Battle of Omega Nebula, and the galaxy was a different place. Captain Jake Morrison walked through the corridors of Unity Station, which was humanity's first permanent installation in Council space. The station orbited a planet that had once been a Council military academy. Now it was being transformed into a joint training facility where humans and Council species learned to work together. It was strange seeing alien beings in military uniforms learning to hold weapons and practice combat drills. These species had lived in peace for thousands of years, and now they were becoming soldiers. Lieutenant Amy Chen joined Jake at an observation window that overlooked the training grounds on the planet below. She watched a human sergeant teaching a group of Council recruits about tactical movement and cover. The aliens looked awkward in their new armor, but they were trying hard to learn. Amy wondered if they would ever truly understand warfare the way humans did. It was not something that could be taught in a few months. It required a lifetime of preparation and a culture that valued strength and readiness. Jake understood her thoughts without her saying anything. The council species would never be warriors like humans were. They did not have the history or the instincts or the mindset, but they were learning to protect themselves, and that was enough. They would never need to be as good as human soldiers. They just needed to be good enough to hold the line until help arrived. Admiral Lisa Hayes had been promoted to Supreme Commander of Galactic Defense Forces. It was a newly created position that gave her authority over all military operations in Council space. She spent her time traveling between Unity Station and Earth, working to integrate human and Council forces into a unified command structure. It was difficult work because the two groups had completely different approaches to everything, but slowly they were making progress. In her office on Unity Station, Hayes met with Colonel Kevin Sanders and several Council military advisors. They were planning the deployment of rapid response fleets throughout the galaxy. The old system of relying on a few massive fleets had failed against the swarm. They needed smaller mobile forces that could respond quickly to threats and hold positions until reinforcements arrived. One of the Council advisors was concerned about the cost of maintaining permanent military forces across such a vast area. His species had not kept standing armies for over 1,000 years. The economic burden would be significant, and many Council members questioned whether it was necessary. Hayes listened patiently, then explained the reality they now faced. The cost of being unprepared was extinction. The swarm had nearly destroyed everything because the Council had no defenses. They could either invest in military readiness now or pay an infinitely higher price later. The advisor's body language shifted to acceptance. He agreed that the Council had learned a terrible lesson. Peace was valuable, but it required strength to maintain. They had thought they could build a civilization without warriors. The swarm had proven them wrong in the most brutal way possible. On Earth, the end of the quarantine had changed everything. Humanity could finally trade freely with the galaxy and access Council technology and knowledge. New colony ships were being prepared to settle worlds beyond the old boundaries, but Earth had also become something unexpected. Council species came by the thousands to visit the homeworld of the warriors who had saved them. They walked through military museums trying to understand the species that had turned warfare into science. Commander Ryan Blake had retired from the fleet to become Earth's ambassador to the Council. He stood in the Grand Assembly Hall addressing representatives from 100 different species. He spoke about the 300 years of quarantine and what it had meant for humanity. They had been called dangerous and violent. They had been locked away like criminals. But when the Council faced extinction, they had called for help from the very species they feared. Blake's words were measured but firm. Violence was not evil in itself. It was a tool that could be used for good or bad purposes. Humanity had fought because they understood that predators existed in the universe. They had learned through bitter experience that sometimes force was the only answer to force. The quarantine had actually made them stronger. It had forced them to rely on themselves and to maintain their edge. When the Council needed them, they had been ready. The Assembly listened in silence. Many of the species present had voted for the quarantine centuries ago. They had genuinely believed they were protecting the galaxy from a dangerous species. Now they understood what they had really done. They had not contained a threat. They had forged the sword that would one day save them all. Commander Nick Palmer was now an instructor at the Joint Fighter Academy. He worked with students from dozens of different species, teaching them to fly combat missions. It was challenging because most of them came from cultures where personal risk was minimized. They had been raised to value safety above everything else. Teaching them to push past their fear and take calculated risks was difficult but necessary. One of his students was struggling during a training exercise. The student was from an avian species, and their natural instincts told them to flee from danger. Nick was patient but direct. Fear was natural and useful, but it could not control them. They needed to learn to function despite fear. That was what separated soldiers from civilians. Every human pilot felt fear too, but they had learned to act anyway. Sergeant Kelly Brooks had been promoted to lieutenant and now commanded a mixed company of human and Council Marines. Training the aliens for ground combat was harder than teaching them to fly. Combat required split-second decisions and physical courage that did not come naturally to species that had evolved in peaceful environments. but Kelly was determined to turn them into effective soldiers. During an urban warfare exercise, one of her council soldiers froze under simulated fire. Kelly calmly walked through the exercise area and pulled the soldier to safety. She asked what had happened, and the soldier admitted their instincts had told them to run. Kelly understood completely. Those survival instincts had kept their species alive for millions of years. But soldiers had to override those instincts. It required training and repetition until the right responses became automatic. At the Unity Station Memorial Garden, Jake stood before the wall of names. Every human who had died in the Battle of Omega Nebula was listed there. Hundreds of names of people who had given their lives to save a civilization that had imprisoned them. New names were being added as smaller conflicts continued across the galaxy. The swarm was gone, but there were still pirates and raiders and other threats. Amy brought him coffee and they stood together in silence. She mentioned that the new defense grid was operational. Sensor stations ringed the entire galaxy, now linked to rapid response fleets. If anything tried to enter from dark space, they would know within minutes. The galaxy finally had the defenses it should have built centuries ago. Jake thought about how much had changed in just 6 months. A year ago, humanity had been prisoners watching the barrier and dreaming about the stars beyond. Now they were responsible for protecting all of Council space. It was a heavy burden, but also a purpose. This was what humanity had been meant to do. Not because they loved violence, but because they understood its necessity. In the years that followed, the relationship between humanity and the Council continued to evolve. There were disagreements and cultural misunderstandings and occasional tensions. Some Council species remained uncomfortable with human military culture. Some humans grew frustrated with Council bureaucracy, but they worked through these problems because they had to. The galaxy was dangerous and cooperation was the only way to survive. Human shipyards worked alongside Council facilities, building new warships that combined the best of both civilizations. Council energy shields and faster-than-light drives were integrated with human armor and weapon systems. The result was a fleet more powerful than anything either group could have built alone. Admiral Hayes stood on the bridge of the new flagship Endeavour during its first mission. The ship was twice the size of the Liberty, with a crew that was 30% Council species. Humans and aliens worked side by side at every station. The integration was succeeding beyond anyone's expectations. On Earth, in a classroom at the Naval Academy, instructors taught military history to students from across the galaxy. They studied ancient human battles and modern tactics. They learned about sacrifice and courage and the principles of warfare. One young cadet asked if humanity would have been ready for the swarm if the quarantine had never happened. The instructor considered the question carefully. Probably not, he admitted. The quarantine had forced humanity to stay sharp and maintain their warrior culture. If they had been accepted into Council space early, they might have gone soft like everyone else. Sometimes adversity created strength, but the future belonged to the students in that classroom. They would have both the strength to fight when necessary and the wisdom to build peace when possible.